Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the last session of our legal research series. Our presenter today is Dan Brackmann. He is a reference librarian at the University of South Carolina Law Library. Before we get started, here are some webinar norms and technical aspects. We ask that all attendees mute their microphones. We ask that all attendees turn off their video camera in order to save on bandwidth. If you have any questions or technical problems, please ask using the chat box. To make the screen of the PowerPoint bigger, you may click on Hide Everyone. You can also zoom in or out of the PowerPoint screen. You can also take screenshots of the PowerPoint screen. After the webinar, a link to the recording and the PowerPoint slides will be sent out to the registered participants.
Hello, everyone. My name is Dan Brackmann, and I'm a law librarian at the University of South Carolina. Thank you for showing up for my part of the Legal Research webinar series. Today, I'm going to be talking about state and federal cases, forms, and court rules. And that's a lot, so we're going to move through it kind of quickly. You can try throwing a question in the chat if you have one as I'm going along, but primarily I'm intending to handle questions at the end. That makes it easier for me to remember to sort of repeat the question for the recording. Having said that, as Megan indicated, the slides are going to be given to you, so I've done my best to make them useful tools without me talking over them. With no further ado, let's get started. I'm going to start with a shameless plug. Everything I'm going to be discussing today is kind of a gross oversimplification. I only have an hour, less since I'm allowing time for questions. And everything that I'm saying today can be found in the Circuit Writers Basic Legal Research Training LibGuide. I've highlighted the 2 points here that are for cases, but the whole thing covers a lot of the topics that the entire legal research series is talking about. So how are we going to do today's webinar? We're going to start by talking about basic case law concepts that you sort of need to have in the back of your mind to understand the rest of the discussion. We're going to talk about how you read and interpret a citation. We're going to talk about how you go about locating case law. And then we're going to get to forms, and with forms, we're also going to talk about court rules. I know that many of you probably get a lot of questions from patrons about forms, or at least that's the feedback I've seen from public librarians. At the same time, it's one of the areas where we don't really have a lot of resources, but I'll talk about what we do have. I've got 3 assumptions that I want to make clear that sort of frame this presentation. I'm assuming that most of the people who are listening to the webinar really don't have access to dedicated legal research resources. You don't have expensive Westlaw or Lexis databases. You don't have large collections of cases published in reporters. You're kind of limited to maybe a very basic collection of statutes and the internet. So that's kind of going to be the focus of my presentation. I'm also assuming that you're all librarians. So we're going to focus on core librarian skills, the things you're good at, information organization systems, and search techniques. We're not going to be trying to get you to be lawyers and to master lawyer skills, by which I mean making judgments about what the law says or doesn't say, or what is appropriate or not appropriate. And then the third assumption is that you really are seeing 2 kinds of questions, and this is more focused towards public librarians, and that is the patrons usually come in saying, hey, I've got a name of a case, I need to find this case, or I have a citation to a case, or somebody said there's a case. They've got some starting point, and they want to find that case. And then the more challenging situation is they know that they need a case, but they don't know anything else. I was in court, I need a case about whatever it is. This is an area where you have to be careful. And you have to be careful because they'll say, I want a mandatory case, or I need an on-point case, and you can't make those judgments. And when I have put UPL in here, that's an abbreviation for unauthorized practice of law, which means you're doing the jobs that the lawyers do. And I will touch on this in a couple more places in this presentation, but you want to avoid that. In South Carolina, the unauthorized practice of law is a felony, and we don't want to encourage you to commit felony. So the more judgment they're asking you to exercise, the more you have to be aware of the UPL issue. So let's move into basic concepts. We divide the law into several different categories, like we have civil law and criminal law. The one that really matters for understanding and locating cases is that we have a division between state law and federal law, and we have divisions between state courts and federal court. And a number of your patrons won't understand that. To them, the court system is sort of this ubiquitous whole. But to find cases and to look in the right places, you need to sort of know that there's that division, and you try to figure out where the case you're looking for falls in that division. So what is a case? A case is simply the application of the law to an actual situation. If you recall some of my colleagues' earlier presentations about statutes, statutes apply general concepts. They're often incomplete or ambiguous, and they're always sort of forward-looking. You don't pass a statute that says what this person did 10 years ago, that we're going to make illegal and to prosecute them for. It's usually looking forward. From this day forward, it will be illegal too. Cases, by contrast, do not generally deal with general concepts. You don't have a case unless you have a specific situation with real people fighting about something. And then the court is going to try to apply the law to that situation. A case should always result in a decision, and the court orders something or dismisses the case. And cases don't look forward, really. The most forward in time they look is the present. You are creating a noise nuisance, you need to stop. But it's still a present situation. It's not usually, you're going to be doing this in 5 years and I want to make you stop now. Or we look at something you've done in the past that you may have liability for. So when I talk about case law, what I'm really talking about is the written record of all of these cases, because the court makes a decision and they write it down. And the reason we have this sort of written record, and it goes back to the Middle Ages, is because the courts and people generally, we want to see the law applied consistently. Now, sometimes they're mandatory, meaning another court has to follow the decision, and sometimes they're not mandatory. Making that determination is not your job. That's a lawyer's job, and you don't want to get yourself caught in the trap of doing it. You don't really need to know whether it's mandatory, but it helps to understand that courts are trying to be consistent. That's why we look at what past courts have done with similar situations and how they interpreted a law that perhaps is ambiguous. I can make an analogy to a library. A library policy is kind of like a statute or a regulation. You've got this thing, it says, this is our policy. But inevitably, in every library I've ever seen, the occasional weird situation comes along that doesn't quite fit in the policy. Librarians will often say, well, we don't want to treat people differently. So when we had a situation like this before that was kind of weird, what did we do? Or if it's a completely new situation, they may hop on their library chat boards and say, hey, people in other libraries, I just had this really bizarre thing, and what did you guys do? How did you handle the situation? That is, in a nutshell, all the concept of precedent really is about. What did we do before, and what did other people do with similar situations? Because it's a lot easier to be consistent and to follow another person's example than it is to have to invent things whole cloth. You need to understand that we have these two parallel court systems, both of which have trial level courts, and then they have some level of intermediate appellate courts, and then usually there's one or more Supreme Courts sitting at the top of the system. Cases move through these systems, but they don't usually jump to the other system. So you either have a matter of state law that's in a state court, or you have a matter of federal law that's in a federal court. Sometimes you will see issues jump from state appellate courts to the US Supreme Courts, but that is usually when it involves a federal law or the US Constitution. It's not all that common for this to happen, but be aware that you can get some crossover this way. You're not going to see crossover from the federal system to the state system. So what are the key basic concept takeaways? Cases are the results of actual situations. Case opinions are in fact law. They are law every bit as much as statutes are. The statute webinar mentioned that that's how the legislature makes law. Rebecca mentioned in her regulations webinar that regulations are how the executive branch makes law. Cases are how the judicial branch makes law. And it's very important to remember that different courts record those cases in different places. Historically, when I say different places, I mean books. But in the age of the internet, that gets a little more nebulous. So when it comes to a legal citation, as a librarian, you really only need to be able to read it. You have to be able to interpret the citation. You should never have to be in a situation where you are having to create the citations. If you're curious about how to do that, or you want more detail about citations, the Circuit Rider LibGuide has a much more extensive discussion of citation than I'm going to give you. My focus here is that when you see one, you will be able to translate it and know where to look for the case you're trying to find. So let's talk about the citation system before we really get into a citation. Cases are published chronologically. As the court issues cases, they're collected and they're put in books in the order the cases are issued. We call these books reporters, which is a really imaginative name because they report case results. Reporters are basically numbered volumes. So there's volume 1, volume 2, volume 3, and so forth. All right, we call these series of numbers series. So reporters are published in numbered series. And essentially in a citation, the way you locate a case is it tells you the number of the volume, the name of the reporter, and the first page of the case. And with book and page, you can find any case that's published in a book. We have different kinds of reporters. And this is where it starts to matter that you have in mind some of the differences in the system. Federal cases are not published in the same reporters that state cases are published in. If you have a patron who comes in and they've got a citation for a federal case and they're trying to find it in some sort of a state resource, it's not going to work, and vice versa. We also break things out by jurisdiction. South Carolina publishes its reports in one place, Georgia publishes its reports in a different place. And the different levels of the courts will often be published separately. In the US federal system, for example, the Supreme Court is published in a different set of books than other appellate courts. And that is still a different system from the trial level courts. Sometimes you get topical reports like bankruptcy reporter. We're really not going to cover that today. It's beyond the scope. Most of the citations or references a patron is going to bring you, in my experience, don't go to specialized reporters. Usually they're working off of somebody's much more general news article that they found or another case or the other side's pleading or something. But you should be aware that the same case can be published in more than one reporter. Sometimes your citation will have references to more than one, and we'll see that in a second. Having done that preliminary bit, let's talk about what a citation looks like. Here is a citation to a South Carolina case. The basic structure of a legal citation is that it leads with the case name, which really doesn't do much to locate a case, but we're human beings. We like names. It's much more meaningful us to say the Evening Post case rather than the case at 363 South Carolina 452. Historical reasons and other things like that, but we always lead with the case name. The next thing that will come after the case name is the core location information. Where do I find it? For your purposes, that's the most important part. And then the last thing in a basic citation is the parenthetical, and it includes sort of surplus information. It will usually have the date that the case was decided, and it may have additional information about what the court was, for example. Let's break down this Evening Post citation a bit more. We start with the case name. There's the volume number. There's the name of the first reporter, South Carolina. And you can see it's abbreviated SC. Then we get to the page number in South Carolina. That's the first page of the case. So if we had the South Carolina Reporter book, we would find volume 363. We'd open that volume to page 452, and there would be the Evening Post case. The next thing you see is the citation to the second reporter, because this case appears in two places. And again, it's the same format. Volume number, the abbreviation for the second reporter, Southeast Second, and the first page, 496. And then finally, we have the parenthetical, which here just has the year of decision. At risk of complicating the situation, I can also look at this citation and I know it's the South Carolina Supreme Court. And I know it is because one of the rules for citation is that if it were any other South Carolina court, it would have to say something in the parenthetical. If all it has is the date, it should be the Supreme Court. Here are the federal reporters. It's easiest usually to look, and if you see these reporters or their abbreviations, then you know you're looking at a federal case. Alternatively, if you know you're looking for a federal case, you know that it should be in one of these reporters. The reporters I'm highlighting are the United States reports. That's the official US Supreme Court reporter, and Supreme Court reporter, which is almost official but very authoritative. And you can see that I've got their abbreviations US and SCT kind of hanging off the end there. At the next level, the Intermediate Court of Appeals for the United States is the US Courts of Appeal, and they publish their cases in the Federal Reporter. And the Federal Reporter has gone into multiple series because there's a lot of US Courts of Appeals. So we have Federal, Federal Second, Federal Third. I'll explain a little more about the series in a slide in a bit. And they also publish something called Federal Appendix, which is fairly new. You're not likely to see it, but it is out there. Then the trial system for the federals publishes the U.S. District Court opinions in the Federal Supplement, or FSUP. State courts generally do not publish trial level decisions. So if you have a patron who comes in and wants the trial level documentation for a case, you're probably not going to find it. They need to go to the courthouse and talk to the circuit clerk there. But the federal system does publish its opinions for the trial level stuff. So that's where we get FSUP from. State case reporters. Many states have official state reporters. Those are going to be indicated usually by an abbreviation for the state. So South Carolina's SC, North Carolina's NC, Georgia's GA, and so on. Some states have done away with their official state reporters, and they rely on what are called regional reporters. So what's a regional reporter? Regional reporters are unofficial in most cases. They cover areas of the country. So they will include cases from several states all mixed together. If you recall from our earlier site, we had a site to South Carolina, and then we followed it with a site to Southeast 2nd. Southeast 2nd is the Southeast reporter, and that's South Carolina and Georgia and some other states, just kind of all clumped together. And those were popular back in the day of print because it allowed a lawyer to collect. With one book, they got cases from multiple states. And because we sort of developed the system where we have regional reporters and state reporters, we have citations to both. In fact, a proper citation, if there's two places that the case is available, will include references to both because the person doing the citation doesn't know what book you have available to you. Other things you might find in the citation, and I'm throwing these out here because I don't want you to see them in panic and be like, oh my gosh, I don't know what that is. First example is court names in the parenthetical. If you remember earlier, I indicated that because all we saw was the date and no other information, we knew it was the South Carolina Supreme Court. This is what it would have looked like if it was the South Carolina Court of Appeals. Because of that rule we have about assumptions in South Carolina, if you wanted to cite to the South Carolina Court of Appeals, you'd have to indicate that the case came from that level. Sometimes you'll see a citation to a specific page number, and lawyers will call that a pin cite. And that is usually, you get the first page of the case, there's a comma and another number. And that other number is basically just a reference to a specific page. You'll see it with quotations. If they're quoting from a specific page, they will cite to the case, and then they will give you the specific page for the quote. Finally, I alluded to this a bit ago when we saw Southeast 2nd in my earlier example. That's an indication of the series. The Southeastern reporter's basically gone from volume 1 to volume 999 or something like that. And they didn't want to go to 1000. So instead, they started the second series, and they ran that till they were at volume 999 again. And then they started Southwest 3rd with volume 1. So when you see something like that, immediately after the reporter name, know that we're indicating series. And of all of these things, that's the one that's important to you, because 15 Southwest is a different book than 15 Southwest 3rd. Another way to tell that it's a series number is that it has the legal version of an ordinal. So that's why that D is there. For some reason, lawyers got lazy and decided to do away with the R's. So we do 2nd with 2D, 3rd with 3D, 4th, 5th, 6th, all have TH. But if you see something like those D's or a TH, realize that that is a series identifier. That's not part of a page number. And then finally, in talking about citation, I want to mention something that's sort of up and coming. It's developing in various places. It's called public domain or media neutral citation. And it's come about because states have wanted to get away from print. They've realized that this internet thing is not going to go away. As long as they are having to publish an official version, that means they're relying on a corporate publisher that holds them hostages in some ways. They developed a citation format that does not rely on a book or page identification. South Carolina doesn't do this, but several states do, and the number seems to be growing. So I'm throwing this out here just in case somebody brings this in, because I don't want you saying, this is a citation, and it's not like any citation that Brackmann talked about. Here's how it works. We start with the case name, just like any other citation. But the next thing we get is the year of the decision. Then we get the state's postal abbreviation, and then we get a sequential case number. Now, I've got a blog link here that you guys can click to if you want more information. But basically, what this citation tells us is that this is the 126th opinion issued by the Maine Supreme Court in the year 2015. With that, we can find it, especially if we're doing internet searches on the Maine Judiciary's webpage. So if you go to the Supreme Court of Maine or the Maine Courts page and try to search for this, That will help you find it. And that's what it's designed to do. It's independent of book and page. The good news with citations like this, if you see one, is that you're probably not looking at something that hasn't been digitized, because all of these are going to be fairly recent, and a lot of our digitization goes back to about 1990, but these will all be after that. If you see this kind of a citation, realize you at least should be able to find it electronically pretty easily. The key takeaways for citation: different reporters publish different cases. The volume numbers are the number that come before the reporter name, and the page numbers are the numbers that come after the reporter name. With that information, you can find almost anything. If you see an abbreviation for a reporter and you don't know what it is, Google is your friend. You can Google that abbreviation and you can find out what the reporter is. And in doing that, you should be able to determine whether you're dealing with a state case or a federal case and at what level of court you're dealing with. So let's talk about locating a case when we have some information. And again, we're assuming that you do not have shelves and shelves of reporters in your library. And I'm aware that some of the libraries in the state, like Greenville and Richland County, have Westlaw for public consumption, which would make this much, much easier to research any of these cases. I know that the University of South Carolina has a platform for public use called Nexus Uni. Some of the other academic libraries may have that, but I'm assuming that you don't have those. If you do, this becomes a much easier process. Otherwise, your patron comes in and they've got a name or they've got a citation, or often they seem to have a little slip of paper where they've written some stuff down. What you're going to do is you're going to look at that and you're going to try to determine, is this a state or a federal case? Can you tell who the deciding court is? In other words, if I see a citation to US, I can tell it's a federal case and I know it's the United States Supreme Court. My search just got a lot easier. I'm also going to look for useful search terms. I'm going to throw out there right now that citation is a useful search term. But sometimes there's other things, like really uncommon names in the case name. The patron will usually try to tell you everything about what they need because they don't know what's going to help and what's not. So you may discover that you know a bit about what the case should be about. Those are also useful search terms. Once you've sort of assembled these things, now you're going to try to deploy the internet and see if you can find the case. If it's a federal case, here are some good sources for federal cases. Any court web page for the court that decided the case is likely to have it if it's recent enough. And this comes into the it may not yet be digitized. For example, if you wanted to go to the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Fourth Circuit, which is the U.S. Court of Appeals circuit that South Carolina is in, you can go to this link. There's a tab there for opinions. You can go to that tab and you can start trying to find the opinion there. If you're unfamiliar with what the circuit is or what the website is, you can try to Google it, or the US courts have actually got a web page that kind of breaks down who's where and then gives you links to the court's own web pages. So that's the second link I give you. There's also a website called the Public Library of Law. It's nonprofit. They tend to collect a lot of federal cases. Justia is another nonprofit that collects legal information. They have a section for cases and codes, not official, but it's going to be pretty authoritative in terms of what your patrons need. And then the Library of Congress has a special collection of U.S. reports, which is the U.S. Supreme Court reporter. The only thing to be aware of there is it's only going to be the U.S. Supreme Court. These are good places to find it. I don't have the time in this webinar to demo all of them, but I'm happy to talk to anybody at another time about the specifics of these websites. I do want to caution you about something called PACER. PACER stands for Public Access to Court something or another. It is essentially the US government's official engine for court filings. A lot of newspapers use this, lawyers use this. They can go to PACER and pull up a case by docket number, and they can look at all the filings, not just the opinions, but they can look at the motions and the responses to the motions and the petitions and the answers and all this other kinds of stuff that's filed in the case. The problem with PACER when the government shifted to using this electronic means is that they charge for it. Court information is no longer free when you have to go through PACER. So you want to do a search, they're going to charge you for the search. You want to download some court filings, they're going to charge you for each download. And in order to get on PACER, you have to set up an account and give them a credit card. Most libraries, including mine, don't allow patrons to just come in and run charges on a library credit card. If the patron wants to sign up for Pacer and wants to use their own card, that's fine. I personally think for the needs of most patrons, they're going to get a lot of chaff and not a lot of wheat, but that's where you go to get the official look at the file, unless you want to actually walk into the US courthouse and say, I'd like to see the file and here's the docket number for it. An alternative to Pacer, though, is a nonprofit outfit affiliated with Court Listener. It's called Recap, which is just Pacer backwards. And if you want to Google and find it, it really helps to Google Recap Pacer. Otherwise, you'll get a lot of other things under Recap that you don't want. Recap is basically an add-on to web browsers. What it does is when somebody tries to find a case in Pacer, it checks with the Recap archive. And if Recap already has a copy of the case, it pops up and says, hey, you don't need to download this from Pacer. We already have a copy. Do you want our copy? And you can get the copy from Recap for free. If Recap doesn't have it, then it will pop up and say, hey, you're about to download something that we don't have a copy of. When you download it and pay for it, do you mind if we put a copy of it in our archive so that nobody else has to pay for it? And then if you go to this website that I linked to, you can do searches of what Recap has stored, and it's completely free. The disadvantage is that it doesn't have everything. It only has the things that people have downloaded. But from a library perspective, where you can't just have patrons running up Pacer charges, Recap is a viable option for you to see if you can find a court file, especially if what they're looking for some reason isn't actually a case. They want the motion, or they want somebody's response to a motion. Then you're going to have to go to a site like this. Where are good places to find state cases? Once again, the deciding court's webpage is always a good place to look. And again, we're going to have the caveat that if it's an older case, like before 1990, your chances of finding it on that website diminish pretty badly. Now, we can try to find the case with Google, and we're going to talk about that in a minute, or something called the Legal Information Institute, or LII. It's part of Cornell's outreach, and they sort of have links to all kinds of state law resources. So you go there, you click on your state, and it will show you, here's the judiciary page for that state, and you can go there. And that's under primary resources, and then you go to state law resources. There's also an outfit called Ravel Law. They partnered with Harvard to basically go into Harvard's law library and digitize scans of all of Harvard's case law books. Their search engine, to be honest, is not the best, but they have scans of a lot of the book pages for case law from all over the country going way back. I would suggest using the link I provide here specifically, because trying to find it from the Ravel page is complicated, because what Ravel's going to do is try to sell you their analysis services and their big data services and their legal analytics services. And they recently got bought by Lexis, and that's what they're pushing. But part of that purchase agreement was that the Harvard case law collection had to continue to be freely available. It's not where I would go first, but it might be where I would have to go last. And then the Public Library of Law and Justia also have pretty robust state law linkages and collections. So these are the kinds of places you can go to look for state cases. And finally, we have the great oracle, Google. Specifically, I mean Google Scholar, which if you haven't played with it is kind of fun. It's scholar.google.com, and it has an option to choose that you just want to look for case law. Once you select case law, you have the options to limit it to federal courts or courts of specific states. Google happened to know when I made the screenshot that I'm in South Carolina, so it's offering me South Carolina, but I could use select courts to pick any other state and go look for cases there. And the advantage of Google Scholar, well, Google Scholar has several advantages. One of the advantages of which is it has Google-like searching, as you will see in a second. You remember, assumption number 3 was that patrons are going to come in with that reference point, a name or a citation or some notes or something, or they're going to come in simply saying, I need a case about, and then we have to worry about a whole lot more UPL issues. Let's do a scenario that kind of models that first one. They come in with something. You have an apartment complex where one of the tenants is tethering their dog in the courtyard, which is common ground. This dog seems to be aggressive, it growls at people, it acts aggressively, and the landlord is worrying that there may be liability if that dog bites someone. So the landlord has come into the library and they're poking around at whatever legal stuff is available, or they're using the internet, and they determine that South Carolina has a dog bite statute. When they're reading through the dog bite statute, they discover that there's a reference to a case called Clea v. Odom. And there's a little picture of it where it talks about landlords having liability for dogs chained in common areas. The landlord's like, that sounds like my situation. I really want to read this case, not just this little blurb. So how do I find the case? Well, what can we determine from that? We've got a name, Clea v. Odom. They're both uncommon names, so that makes them good search terms. Looking at the citation, we realize that there are cites here to two reporters, South Carolina Reports, volume 394, page 175, and Southeastern Reporter, second series, volume 714, page 542. We can tell that the case was decided in 2011. That will be useful if we have multiple things pop up and we need to figure out which Clea v. Odom case we want to be reading. If we really look carefully, we can tell that this is a South Carolina Supreme Court case because it doesn't say South Carolina appellate in the parenthetical. We also know that it's a case about landlords and tenants and dog bites. So we'll put that in the back of our mind too. Let's try going to the South Carolina courts page. And here's what that looks like. They have a tab for opinions and orders. If you click that, you then have an option for an opinion search, which looks like exactly what we want. So we click that. And we get the page with 5 options for searching, 4 of which are completely useless to us because we don't know things like the docket number or some of the other ways they're set up to search the case. And we realize that their website in a lot of ways is meant for insider use, not really public use. But we do have the option to do full text searches. And we decide that we're going to go with one of these sort of unusual names we've got, Clea. If we search Clea, it gives us 3 results. If we sort of read the text here, we realize that the first one is in fact a Supreme Court case between somebody named Clea and somebody named Lana Odom. The other 2 really aren't, so they're probably citing Clea v. Odom maybe, but the first case appears to be the one we want. We pull it up and in fact it is. It's a 2011 South Carolina Supreme Court case between Clea and Odom, and we could go on to read it and we would discover that it's about dog bites and landlords and tenants and stuff. And you could say, hey, Mr. Landlord Patron, here is the case you wanted. I found it. Note that you have not made any judgments at all about whether or not this is actually the case the landlord needs. You have found the case that the landlord has already identified, and that's something you can do. How would it look if we jump to Google instead of the rather clunky South Carolina judicial search engine? Well, we could do several different searches in Google. We can do Clea v. Odom, because Google handles these sort of multi-word searches much, much better than South Carolina's webpage. We can put in the citation because we have that, 394 SC 175. Or we could just throw in some of those subject terms like landlord dog bite. All of these searches that I've got modeled here, they'll work. You will find the case. The most efficient way to find it is that middle search where we're going for the citation because that is a pinpoint reference. And if we do that, here's what Google gives us. 1 result, option to see more, but Clea v. Odom, there's the citation, 2011, that's our case. So we pull it up, and here's what it looks like if you get it from Google. There's some differences I want to highlight. The Google citation gives us those book and page references. You see them up at the top of the Google page. South Carolina page didn't give us that. This lets us check to make sure that this is actually the case we want a little more precisely. I also happen to think that Google's version is a little more readable. Google gives us individual page breakdowns because we can see where page 177 starts, where page 178 starts. It's just a nicer display. So I obviously prefer the Google version to the South Carolina version. It's probably less official though. So in both versions or any other version of the case you would find, you're going to see some of the same information. And this includes if you pull it up in a book. You're going to see the name of the case. You're going to see the name of the parties. You will see the name of the court, Supreme Court of South Carolina. You're going to see the docket number, which is essentially the number on the file in the courthouse if you wanted to go pull the file and actually look at it. The date the case is decided. It will tell you the name of the judge writing the opinion, and then it's going to have the opinion itself. Some resources will have other options. They're going to have things like citations to the place can be found, other places the case can be found in print. They may have summaries. Those are usually going to be put in by the editors. The high-end databases and the books also tend to put in head notes, which are little blurbs, 1 blurb for each legal point the case is about. And then there's something that lawyers will call flags. And flags are basically indications of what other cases have done with it. So if a case has been overruled by a later case, it would have a flag on it. The Google version, the South Carolina version, a lot of the sort of free internet versions, they're not going to have the flags. It's up to the patron themselves to figure that kind of stuff out. But if you see something like those, you realize they're part of some cases, but they're not going to be included. They're sort of from the editor, not from the court. So let's talk for a bit about searching without a reference. Some of the databases have topical search capability. Google is probably the best one. You saw that we could search for landlord dog bite, and I think like the 11th or 13th result under that search was clia viotum. If we threw in landlord dog bite South Carolina, it would probably get more precise. But a lot of the official state search engines on the court websites just don't have that sort of natural language search capability. They're fairly primitive. At best, they're going to have keyword searching. So, you kind of have to be careful with those, but that's how you would go about doing a topical search. And if somebody came in with a topical search, I probably would reach for Google first, just because its search engine handles that sort of vague generality a lot better than the officials ones do. If they came in with a reference that told me what state I was looking in, then it gets a lot easier. But if all I've got is a name, I need this case clia viotum, it's more confusing. And if all they know is they need a dog bite case, then I think you're kind of definitely in the Google world. You do, however, need to be very careful about the unauthorized practice of law when you get into searching without a reference. Because remember, you can't make any judgments. So you can't decide this is the case that means more to you, or this is what this case is about, or you say you need a case about landlords and dog bites, here is the case you need. The best practice for a librarian in those cases is to say, I can't tell you what you want, but I can show you how to find it. Here are the resources I would use. I am happy to demonstrate any of them for you. I am happy to try to point you to good search techniques, authoritative sites, but at the end of the day, you, the patron, are going to have to do this work because I can't. Now let's get to forms and rules. Questions about forms. People come in and say, I need a court form for. Be aware, South Carolina does not have a lot of forms compared to other states, and we don't have forms for everything. So it is quite possible that your patron is looking for a form that doesn't exist. It's okay to have that be the answer. But at the end of the day, you can't select a form for them. You can't say, here is the form you want. You can't even fill out the form for them because you're making a judgment about what goes in the line. So you mostly can point them at, here's where you get forms from. And that's what the rest of the presentation is going to be about. Again, the South Carolina Judicial Branch on sccourts.org down in Quick Links has a link for court forms. It opens up another one of their not terribly useful search engines because you can search by court type, by form title, or by the form ID number. And the patron usually doesn't know, and doesn't know. To address this problem, the South Carolina School of Law's library made our own in-house index to all court forms in South Carolina. We took them and we broke them down, you'll see, into little boxes based on the kind of form it is. So the patron or you can link to this page or can go to this page and you'll have a better chance of finding the official form with a little bit more explanation than you do using the judiciary's webpage. We also have a whole tab on forms in our Circuit Writer's LibGuide. The court does have some form packets. They're usually on the top page, mostly for high volume family stuff like divorce or child support. And these are a bunch of forms sort of bundled together. If you've got those matters, it's pretty easy for the patron to go to this page, see those packets, and pull the packet. Some of your libraries will have access to a product called Gale Legal Forms. They cover a lot of ground, and they're pretty decent forms. We don't actually have this in the law library, but Richland County Public does. If you have them, it's a good place to also look for forms for patrons. You can't help fill out forms, but there is some assistance available to your patrons. The place we send people is a website called lawhelp.org, which is run basically by legal services. It covers the whole United States. We care about the South Carolina part. They have got several things. It's worth exploring this site. The two things I wanted to highlight are they do offer self-help interviews where you can set up an appointment with a volunteer from the bar to go over certain types of things. And you can see the list on the screen with child support, divorce, orders of protection, and so forth. They also have instructions for filling out a bunch of forms beyond just their interviews. They also offer what they call their classrooms, which is a chance to listen to somebody lecture or talk to you about certain areas of law, and it gives the patron a lot of information. You as a librarian can't give this information, but you can point them to this website and they can look at the resources here and try to get to one of these classrooms. This may help them in a way you can't. Finally, court rules. Anything you're doing in court has to be done by the rules. Frequently, the patron will be like, how do I do this? Where do I find the rule for filing a motion to dismiss? The official court rules are published on the South Carolina Judicial Branch without the clunky search engine. Again, it's a quick link. It takes you to something called the Court Register. The important thing with the Court Register, make sure you are in the right tab, because they break it down for like different kinds of courts have different rules. The rules in probate are different than the general civil rules. You make sure you're in the right court, and then you look at the numbers, and that's how you find court rules. You can try the search engine. I'm not optimistic that it's necessarily going to get them somewhere, but here at least you've got a list that is somewhat meaningful in terms of English that you can kind of scan through like a table of contents. Be careful that you don't direct the patron to a specific rule or even a specific tab, because at that point you're making a legal judgment and you don't want to do that. That sort of concludes my remarks about forms, court rules, cases, where to find them, what they mean. And I've got about 10 minutes for questions if anyone has any. I probably also should mention, I've got links here to the Circuit Rider page again, but our law library welcomes reference questions from any other library in the state who's having trouble with South Carolina legal research. Our reference hours are generally 9 to 5. Right now, we obviously do not have in-person reference hours, but we are still servicing reference through emails or chats. You can even call the reference desk and we get an email that there's a voicemail and we will get back to you. Did I say that Google Scholar is free, like Google? Yes, it is. It's completely free. You just need to throw scholar.google.com and you'll go to that site. You can also use it to search for academic articles, which is what that other dot was. One was articles, one was law cases. And if you need anything, feel free to consult the Circuit Rider's guides or to contact us at our reference desk.
Dan, there was another question. She can't remember the last one that you talked about, but is it free as well?
All the resources I mentioned should be free. If she meant law help, that's free. Obviously, the state webpage is free. Our LibGuide is free. Google's free, which was the example here. I'm not sure which one is the last one, but I think almost all the resources I mentioned, including Justia and the Public Library of Law, are all free resources. Does that answer the question?
Yes, she put, okay, thanks so much. So very helpful.
Great. And those are not the only free ones out there, but I didn't have time to dig into absolutely everything. And some of them are, in my opinion, very clunky to try to find information. Talking to Megan beforehand, I don't know if any of you were academic librarians. Obviously, my presentation was geared more towards public librarians getting questions from the general public. The kinds of questions that a professor might ask in the course of doing research are very different, and you don't have to deal as much with worries about the unauthorized practice of law. So, if we had any academic librarians out there who had slightly different sorts of questions, I certainly would welcome those.
Are the videos also going to be posted on the Circuit Rider's LibGuide as well?
Yes, we're creating a tab for those videos, and we're linking to your YouTube version.
Oh, awesome.
We're putting the link to your YouTube version. We are posting the PowerPoints themselves, so that's another source for the PowerPoints. And I'm going to use this term very roughly, we're typing up transcripts because we can't close caption the slideshows on YouTube. So we're kind of transcripting what we're talking about, which has been kind of a challenge. And the reason I said transcripts in air quotes is kind of because with some of this stuff where I was showing screenshots, it's really hard to transcript that. So I kind of basically put the transcript demonstrates this on the screen, because without the screen to actually look at to make the reference, it's difficult.